Ha 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 ha!
Is that it now?
Yes, yes. Now I think it is working. Gosh, what it takes.
Yeah, it's even labeled take four. Okay, that's the one.
Yep, that's the one.
Okay, that's kind of funny, guys. That's kind of funny.
More than
All right. Well,
delightful.
I'm assuming, yeah, I guess we're doing a quick audio test here. For anyone that's listening, if you can just confirm that all this is coming through.
Yep.
Uh, we have a friendly human out there who can confirm that this is flying. Is that it now?
Gray
Yes.
Ghost, I appreciate your comment. Learning is indeed all about trial and error.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's even labeled take four. Okay, that's the one.
Yep, that's the one.
Okay.
Okay, apparently we've got some loops going on. What's going on here?
Okay, sorry. I think I had the speakers unmuted here, so I've actually muted the video. So hopefully now I'm not going to mess that up anymore. Okay. Well, okay. With that, I think we're actually ready for our introduction now. Finally.
Fifth time's the charm. Whatever it says on the screen is probably what it was.
Yes,
So
exactly.
we do a podcast. It's called the Good and Basic Podcast, and the general theme is typically our videos, which are usually about making things from scratch and about philosophy. And with the coronavirus going on, we there's a ton of ideas related to the coronavirus that we would like to kind of discuss, like how this affects economics and supply chain and the philosophy of risk and risk management and all kinds of stuff that is really, really interesting. There's some abstract ideas here. What this is not is neither of us are health experts in any way, shape, or form, so that's really not where the discussion is going. We're mostly going to stick to supply chain, risk management, and the ideas that we actually are interested in, and hopefully qualified to say something interesting about.
Yeah,
So
and even to the degree, I would just add to that, even to the degree that we do talk about the disease itself, um, I mean, you need to take everything we say with a grain of salt there. Not only because we're not health experts, but also because there's just a lot of information flying around, and that information changes from time to time, and it's actually remarkably difficult, even if you are listening to experts to tell what's going on. So, caveat. Let's see. Caveat emptor is buyer beware. Caveat lector is reader beware. I'm not sure what uh, listener beware is in Latin, but whatever that is, listener beware. So there we go. Yeah, and actually, I would also add, Joseph mentioned there's quite a few things that we want to talk about, right? In my mind, they kind of fall under the major headings of risk management and risk theory. That's one heading, and then the second heading is supply chains and sort of broad economic issues, and then the third heading is let's call it personal self-reliance and disaster preparedness. And there's actually so much to talk about. Joseph and I, if you don't mind me giving them a little bit of behind the scenes, we actually recorded two podcasts prior to this. We tried to do this, and eventually we decided to go ahead and do it live. And part of the reason
we
for that is
recorded
just
one because the first time we had technical difficulties with the record button. This remote software, which incidentally is a good model for social distancing,
yeah.
has been problematic. We've been trying to figure out how to hit the record button, and apparently I need to learn how to hit the record button. So didn't happen the first time, and the second time the podcast didn't really turn out all that well. So this is another attempt. The learning new software and trying to do this thing via a Zoom conversation, which is being run through OBS, which is then being live streamed onto YouTube. Like trying to figure out the technical side of working remotely is one of the challenges that I see related to the coronavirus outbreak in general. It's just, I mean, we're learning how to work in a different manner, and that applies to us as well.
For sure. Yeah, if I could just, sorry, I wanted to finish my thought there real fast that there's so much to talk about that we don't feel like we can get it all done, but we're going to do our best here to tackle a lot of interesting stuff. So well, I mean, why don't we kind of, well, I don't know, where do we want to start? Do we want to start with risks? Do we want to start with the way this affects, individual lives? Or do we want to start with the supply chain? I mean, maybe we could start with the fact that, the coronavirus is one of those things that affects all of these, right? There are these shocks to the system, right? And, you've mentioned in the past, Joseph, that war and disease are two big ones, but there are these shocks to the system that just ripple outwards and start affecting everything. And those are really interesting circumstances and situations to watch. And I am trying to adjust the audio here. I'm not doing it with too much success, but
I tried to hit the audio on this side. Is that any better? AG,
yeah, hopefully that's a little better. I've adjusted something at my end, so hopefully that is better.
Suddenly I can't hear you hardly at all.
Okay, well, let me tweak it the other direction. How's that?
Not awesome, but slightly better.
Too quiet or too loud?
Too quiet on my end.
How about that?
A little bit higher.
How about that?
That's better. That'll work.
Okay, I think the setting's right back where it was.
Okay. AG, if you wouldn't mind giving another comment saying if that's improved, that would be much appreciated.
Yeah.
So you were saying there are certain events that have giant ripple effects, basically.
Yeah. So there are these events that have these giant ripple effects, and they do radiate outwards, right? Some of the podcasts and thinkers that I listen to, a phrase that I hear getting thrown around quite a bit now is that it's an inflection point, right? It's a point where things curve. It's a point where things change. And so it's really interesting always to watch these major events and watch how they unfold, and watch those ripples spread. So that's what we're all doing here. And thanks. It sounds like we have got the audio fixed, so good for us.
There's a few layers there that I want to unpack. One is that since we're at the beginning of this thing, whatever this thing is, we actually don't know how many ripples there are going to be and how much change there is going to be. And that in and of itself creates a level of uncertainty that is extremely uncomfortable. And so right now, we're about a week into a self-quarantine mode. I'm currently in law school, and law schools across the country here in the U.S. have closed their doors and said we're moving all classes online. And so for the first, starting 2 days ago and then yesterday and today, I've had all of my law school classes online, which, doesn't sound like it should be a huge difference, but, there's the working with the technology angle. That's one side. Then there's studying at home is a very different experience. I mean, it just is a very interesting experience. And then there's the question of, are we going to go back to class before the end of the school year? Probably not. Then there's the question of how this is going to affect the economy in general. Are we in for a big recession? We don't know. Does this change the way that we go about work and daily life in the future? Does this mean that more and more companies have now gotten comfortable with distance working, and now this is a common thing that we experience forever? I've seen some newspaper articles with titles like "This is our new 9/11," where it just defines a new era.
I mean, I actually want to say way bigger than that. Like way bigger than that.
Okay, what's your argument?
Sure, yeah. So I'll pitch my argument that it's way bigger than that. I'm sorry, now I look even a little weirder because I have a little bit of green screen poking behind me. But here we go. Yeah. So I mean, when you think about 9/11, so 9/11 is unquestionably a big deal, and it's indelibly written into the American psyche, right? And there were changes that occurred because of it. Changes to the way airlines operate. Changes to quite a few things, right? And changes to the way we think about the world, at least in the United States, and probably at least to some degree more broadly in the world. But like, I mean, like 9/11. I don't know. I'm just trying to measure the shocks, and the only I know this is like. I mean, 9/11. I had to look up and figure out how it affected the U.S. GDP. But I think, if I remember rightly, that Goldman Sachs originally projected like a 5% contraction in the United States economy because of the coronavirus. And I mean, there's no way to know if that number is correct, right? Because we're still, things are still unfolding and we're still watching things. But assuming that it is even partially true, assuming that, let's just take it as a baseline number, right? So the U.S. economy contracts by 5%. I'm pretty sure that's bigger than 9/11. Like a 5% contraction is insane. It's just absolutely insane. There's no other way to say it.
So in terms of economic effect, I'm not exactly sure. We're seeing very dramatic shifts in the short term. The question is, what do those mean in the long term? And the answer is, we don't know. I mean, predictions, some predictions are better than others, but all predictions have an element of uncertainty attached to them, and so, I mean, there is an element of uncertainty there. One reason why I think the 9/11 analogy is interesting is because that's a time when the rules changed. The rules for travel, the rules for what the state as a whole looked like, the rules for how foreign policy was to be run. All the rules suddenly changed, and the public consciousness of, oh, this is a thing that can happen, burst onto the scene where it really hadn't been there before.
Yeah.
And in the sense that the rules are changing, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the long-term effects are.
Sure. Well, that's some of the stuff that we're both going to speculate on over the course of this and other podcasts in the near future.
Sure.
Is some of those long-term effects. And wow, boy, do we have some speculations, right? Actually, there's something interesting here, which is one of the things that's been interesting to me as we've watched the coronavirus unfold is that one of the ways you might think about shocks is that something happens and then everything changes, right? So, 9/11, in hindsight, we look back and we say, okay, so, there was a massive terrorist attack on U.S. soil, about 3,000 people died. And so that has consequences for the way that we think, for example, in the United States about foreign policy. If there's no 9/11, then there's probably no war in Afghanistan. There's probably no war in Iraq. There's probably quite a few things happening in the Middle East now that don't happen. Obviously the restrictions, the current restrictions and security measures on airline travel aren't there if there's no 9/11. And so, like the world does change quite a bit. And what's so interesting to me is that that's only true as we look back in hindsight, right? As we look back in hindsight, we can see, okay, so there's a shock, and then there's the effects that come from that shock. There's the impact of that shock on people's lives and on the economy. But what's interesting is as you live through these, you actually don't know what it is precisely that you're dealing with, right? So, when we first hear about the coronavirus coming out of China, you hear, okay, so there's an outbreak of coronavirus in China. It's like, okay, well, what does that mean, right? Does that mean that we're going to have a worldwide pandemic and 50% of the population is going to die, like it did when the bubonic plague hit Europe, right?
So bubonic plague was about,
or is this going to be like the bird flu or some of these other recent scares that it looks like it might be scary and then it ends up really not being that scary. And Gray Ghost, so the bird flu may have been worse than corona at this moment. That's kind of the issue, right? Is right now there's quite a few social distancing measures in the United States, which and there's social distancing measures in other places, and a lot of that is out of an abundance of caution, right? We actually don't know if this is going to destroy everything. We don't know we don't know how big this is going to be. Like maybe things actually do get quite a bit better in a month, or maybe they're horrifically bad for 2 years, like it was with the Spanish flu from 1918 to 1920. And we just don't know that. And so as you live through these events, it's quite different from living after the events. When you live after the events, you can look back and say, oh, I understand. That's what happened. And those were the effects, right? But as you're living through it, it's like, what exactly is going on?
It's time for a really bad pun. Hindsight is 2020.
Okay. All right. We need to cut the stream off after that.
Here's something I want to bring attention to and kind of shift the conversation in this direction. So,
sure.
Whether or not this coronavirus is dangerous, that some speculation that 80% of cases are mild, although that is a Chinese statistic, and their definition of mild is doesn't require hospital care. And then there's the question of, well, to get a real statistic, you'd have to know actually how many people are infected, and we don't necessarily know that, and so the numbers are probably inflated right now. But right now we're saying about 3 to 4% mortality rate. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting, yeah, ouch, I assume that was the pun. There's a lot of uncertainty here, but we are now aware of what a disease could do. So moving forward into the future, a year from now, everyone's going to remember that time that everybody got holed up in their houses and all the businesses shut down over this particular pandemic. And we'll know at that point whether or not it was a huge deal or not. Let's assume for now that it's a moderate deal. But when you're aware that that is a thing that could happen, how does that change your life? And it changes your life in a lot of ways that I find really interesting based off of kind of the basic side of our good and basic stuff. Having food storage, being able to make things from scratch, possibly having a garden, definitely having a garden. I mean, food not lawns all the way. Localized production. I mean, these are the things that you start to see, because the idea that a disease starting in China could disrupt global supply chain. I mean, if people don't go to work in China, then you don't get your iPhone. That's a situation that we're in the world because of how globally interconnected we are. Um, and right now, China is actually threatening the United States. They're threatening to cut off access to medical supplies, including antibiotics, because almost all of the U.S.'s antibiotics are produced in China. And so you start seeing all these relationships of dependence, which is something that I am very keyed into. I'm very interested in relationships of dependence in the first place.
Yeah.
And this outbreak, or this coronavirus, seems to have highlighted how vulnerable a lot of our supply chains are, and how many dependencies we have that are possibly the supply chains are possibly too long and or not diversified enough. I mean, maybe if you are getting your manufacturing done in 5 different countries, then any bad thing that happens in one is fine, and you can still have the globalization of your supply chain without, drastically bringing it home. But you can still get some of the benefits of drastically bringing it home. What I'm interested in here is that it's just really interesting that this outbreak raises the idea of local production, independence, having a buffer supply of food and toilet paper, knowing about toilet paper alternatives, as I released a recent video on that. I mean, some very good and basic themes are emerging through the news right now.
Yeah, no, exactly, right. And I mean, this sort of starts to. There's one thing I want to touch on real fast that you were talking about before we moved on to sort of personal preparedness, which is that even if this coronavirus doesn't turn out to be, significantly lethal, I mean, even if it turns out to be just, let's say, a bad seasonal flu, what's interesting is that we are now much more aware of all the ways that we're vulnerable to diseases. We're much more aware of the possibility of a disease sweeping the world. Even if this one isn't that disease, we all now have our antenna up and we're thinking, okay, well, even if the coronavirus turns out to be not so bad, how are we protected? How are we resistant to, or how are we resilient towards a worse disease coming along in a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years.
And not just
and so
diseases.
On some level, it almost doesn't matter how bad the coronavirus is right now. Like, I know it matters for many of the decisions we're making now, but kind of in the big picture, it's like, it's the possibility of these massive events that makes us need to think about supply chains and about local production.
Yeah, absolutely. Chaos Swiss roll. I agree with you 110%. My secret hope from this is that gardening and home canning become mainstream, as does having a little bit of food and a little bit of toilet paper stashed away for a rainy day, a little bit of food, a little bit of clothing, because having a buffer is just incredibly useful. Because then, let's say that there is a shock to the system that would normally create a run to the grocery stores. If on average people have a month, 2 months of groceries kind of stockpiled, then the rush really isn't there. You can spread that out. If everybody has a garden, then the problem goes more or less to zero. I think that the thing that's cool about personal preparedness and gardening is that if there's a macro scale event, like say a war or a famine or a coronavirus pandemic, you're protected. But even on the micro scale, let's say you lose your job and you're suddenly looking for a new job for the next 3 months. Wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to go grocery shopping during that time?
Yeah.
It's helpful both on the macro and also on the micro scale for dealing with risk. And risk is a fact of life.
Well, and it's so interesting to me, right, that having some food and toilet paper stored up is, I mean, it's very much like insurance, right? And when is the best time to buy insurance? Well, before whenever it's needed.
Yeah,
right?
Before you need it.
Because when it happens, it's too late. And so I do think that a lot of people will, shift their thinking a little bit and at least think in terms of, okay, well, what are some measures that I could reasonably take, right? You may not be able to, let's say, raise your own beef cattle. That might be outside your range of possibilities. But, it might be possible for you to, forego some expenses in, forego some luxury goods, or forego some, gosh, I'm trying to think of the word, forego some consumer purchases in order to have a cash reserve, or to, let's say, grow potatoes or corn periodically, or to have a food reserve, right? These are all things that are in the reach of many people that I think people will start to think more in terms of.
One
And they
thing
should.
that I'm
I mean, they
curious
absolutely
about,
should, right? Because the thing about these risks is that you don't know the precise nature of the shock event that's coming, but you can be pretty sure that there will be a shock event at some point. If you wait long enough, there will be a shock event, and you need to be ready for it so it doesn't knock you out entirely.
yeah, yeah.
Actually, if you don't mind me following up on that, other Joseph and I both live in Utah, and we had kind of a dramatic event happen. Let me see, how long ago was it now?
3 days, something like that. I think it was Wednesday morning.
Wednesday morning? Yeah, I think that would have been Wednesday morning. If I've got that right, yeah, because today's Friday, yesterday was Thursday. Yeah, and it wasn't yesterday. It was Wednesday morning, right? Okay, so Wednesday morning, we actually had a mid-size, I would say, earthquake in Utah. And it was when I say mid-size, there was some light infrastructural damage, but all in all, not too bad, especially considering that Utah's due for a much larger earthquake, let's say. So Utah, especially the Wasatch Front, really is an earthquake zone, and we really could get leveled by a pretty severe earthquake. I think the number that I saw was something like a 57% chance of a magnitude 6 or larger earthquake in the next 50 years, right? Which is, not an immediate threat, but it is something that makes you sit up and take notice and plan for the future. And so we actually did have this, moderate-sized earthquake Wednesday morning of 5.7, and it happened at about 7 in the morning here, I think, a little after 7. And as soon as it hit, right, so everything starts shaking. And the very first thing I think is, oh man, like, of course this is the kind of thing that would happen in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so one of the interesting things about these risks is that you can't even count on the risks coming one at a time, right? They actually could get compounded. So imagine if Los Angeles got like a 6.5 or a 7.5 earthquake right now, right? Disaster, absolute disaster, right? It's like no matter what risks you think you're preparing for, there's probably quite a few more that could hit.
It's like that saying, it can always get worse. I mean, never say it couldn't get any worse. But it is interesting because I'm going to sound like a paranoid person for like 30 seconds. You ready for this? Where I live in a suburban area in Utah, in an area that's typically known as the Mormon Corridor, it's kind of this long valley that's full of all the major cities in Utah. And, I can see that there's basically 2 major highways that are connected to here. And then we have a railway line, and then we have our airport, which means, and most of the food is coming in, on trucks, as is common here. So what if, let's say, you had a landslide in 1, 2, 3 of these roads that are coming into the Salt Lake Valley? I mean, you get laid siege to by nature. Nature lays siege to the city, and suddenly you're cut off from your food supply.
That's a good way of putting it.
That is an awkward thing that is totally possible if you're not growing your own food, because the longer that supply line is, the easier it is to get cut.
Yes.
And so, I mean, Immigration Canyon, which is where I-80 runs through, I mean, if
it's just a simple calculation of more points of failure.
Yeah, more points of failure. I mean, that's what you're looking at. There will always be points of failure. I mean, if you're growing your own food, there is the weather, and there are your neighbors, and there are the local pests, and there are your own incompetencies, and all kinds of points of failure. But I get more uncomfortable as you run into more single points of failure within a system. If you have a single point of failure within a system, it's only a matter of time. And I don't like having lots of points of failure that are outside of my control or outside of my influence. So that's another reason for home preparedness and growing your garden. Grow a garden.
And it's not only the number of points of failure, but there's also a calculation on which specific points of failure you're going to lay yourself vulnerable to, right? So, for example, I mean, the obvious example is one of the questions that we're all going to be asking going forward is, okay, so how are Europe and the United States and other places in the world going to interact with China going forward, right? Because there's a clear risk here that, perhaps we did not calculate in as well as we should have. We did not prepare for as well as we should have. So how's that going to affect things, right? Are you still going to want to rely on China for production? To what degree are you going to want to rely on that? Or would you prefer to rely on domestic production? Or would the United States prefer to rely on Europe? Or would Europe prefer to rely on someone besides China? Right, and I mean, there could be multiple answers to that question, but those are the questions that are going to be asked, and probably some of the answers are going to be, hey, our supply chain is just a little bit vulnerable here.
I think you can actually subdivide it by a couple of things. So on the side of products, you have some products which are absolutely essential for yourself no matter what happens, like food and medicine. So do
Sure.
you want all of the food that is in your country to be imported? Probably not, because that puts you in a really difficult bargaining position where you have a 30-day time limit during which you can negotiate for changes in tariffs and changes in the relationship with whoever's supplying you with your food. Because after that 30-day time limit, you're all dead. Um, and before that, you have all kinds of problems. So I think there is a time limit attached to that. Also, medicine. I think weaponry is another one that you want to be providing for yourselves. But some luxury goods, I mean, sure, whatever. That could be supplied with a super long supply chain. I don't really. If it's not utterly essential, maybe the calculation is different for how much vulnerability it can be exposed to. Then the question is, are iPhones absolutely essential?
Well, yeah, and I mean, one of the interesting things about these large shocks is that it's not clear how far the shock extends, right? It's not clear what the consequences of this are, and it's not clear, okay, so clearly our system is not as well adapted as it could be. So just how unadapted is it, right? How many changes do you have to make? And maybe that's it's small changes, right? Or perhaps it's large changes, like maybe you're mentioning, okay, so do we need iPhones? And I mean, it's hard to answer that. I'm tempted to say yes, because like a lot of people rely on iPhones, right? So for instance, you and I couldn't be having this conversation right now without some internet level infrastructure and technology, right?
Sure.
So I'm so sorry, I lost my train of thought. We couldn't be doing it without that technology, and so a really good question is, okay, well, wait a second, we probably do need some kind of infrastructure. Joseph, could you use like earphones or something? Do you have anything like that that might get rid of the echo? Thanks, guys, for chiming in. All you in the chat.
Come on.
Well, thank you, Ian. That doesn't help for both Josephs.
Let's see here. Aha! Let's see if this improves things. The audio jack on my computer
Ian, I'm
is
assuming you
broken.
mean Joseph Bjork, because I've got headphones on. So, I mean, well, here's another thing I was thinking. I was talking to one of my uncles recently, and he's a really fascinating individual. I'm hoping to get him on the channel sometime. He's the kind of guy who's raised llamas in his backyard, raised sheep in his backyard. Quite a few interesting things. Fascinating individual, very intelligent, very well read, and very resourceful. But he and I were talking a few months ago, and he mentioned, if you stop and think about it, the United States power grid has only existed for less than 100 years. We've only had an electric grid for, I don't know exactly what the numbers would be, but let's say 100 years, right? So in 1920, you probably don't have a developed electrical grid, right? So it makes you realize, and then, you could go down the list and say, okay, well, what about plane travel, right? We've only had commercial air travel for the last, I don't know, let's say 70 years, right? Since the 1950s, maybe. Pick a number. And globalization, again, depends on how you measure it, but let's say it's only existed since the 1980s. Again, it's a hair arbitrary, but let's pick a number, right? So something really interesting when you think about this is, okay, so we are living in a wildly different world than our ancestors, even just 100 years ago, lived in. We're living in a wildly different world. And so what's interesting is we don't actually know how resistant that world is to shocks. We don't know how resistant that world is to changes. It's entirely possible that we're living in a very, very, very fragile system that has just been, fortunate enough to not run into something that can take it down yet. Right?
I think that intuition is felt by a lot of people, which is probably one of the reasons why there is a prepper movement. I mean,
this intuition that everything might be a little bit more fragile
and
than it looks.
It's not a prediction that things are going to break. It is an assessment that the current state of affairs is fragile, which means I don't know what the shock is going to be, but a shock can come. And if a shock does come, then because it's fragile, bad things will happen.
Yeah, well, and these, yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, one of the ways that you could look at this is you could say, well, we think. So I'm thinking in evolutionary terms here for a second, right? So in terms of evolution and natural selection, if something hangs around for millions of years or hundreds of millions of years, you're like, okay, that looks like it's very well adapted to the environment. If it survived that long, it's very well adapted to the environment. Now, if there's some kind of change or mutation that has only existed for 1,000 years or 100 years or 10 years, then it's like, okay, well, we don't know how well adapted to the environment it is. We don't know how resistant to shocks it is because it just hasn't lasted very long. It hasn't endured very many things, right? And so it's very tempting. Like I'm really, it's tempting to look at our system and say, oh, like, look at how strong and robust we are. We have this massive, trillions of dollars of GDP, and we can fly people around the world at hundreds of miles an hour. And it's like, yeah, like you can do that. That's very impressive, but we actually don't know how strong this system is because, things like the electrical grid have only been around for 100 years, and things like airlines have only been around for 70 years, and things like the internet have only been around for 25, 30 years. And so we actually don't know how strong our system is at all. We don't know how strong our system is at all. And, I mean, pandemics do come around. Like, this isn't the first pandemic that's ever happened in human history, right? So 1918 to 1920, you have the Spanish flu. That's the most recent, really large world scale one that I can think of. There's the bubonic plague. There's plenty of others that I'm having trouble drawing to mind right now. But plagues are not new to human history. This is a thing.
Happy
right?
birthday.
Yeah, happy birthday, Flicky the Ricky Bob. So may you have a good birthday in your social isolation. So our best wishes to you. I mean, it's so tempting to look at our system, at the way we run society and the way we live and be like, oh, this is so stable, this is so strong, everything is great, right? It's like, well, we don't know that at all. We don't know that at all. And in fact, the evidence from this is, no, it's actually not very stable at all. It's quite vulnerable. And one of the things, for example, is vulnerable to is pandemics. And if it's vulnerable to pandemics, it could be vulnerable to quite a few other things.
So I want to point out a couple of things that tend to make vulnerability. So this language of looking at things in terms of whether they are robust or fragile or anti-fragile comes from a philosopher by the name of Nassim Taleb, who we've talked about quite a bit on the podcast. And when you look at this, what are some things that could make you fragile? Living paycheck to paycheck, that makes you fragile. If you are living paycheck to paycheck, all of your predictions that you are making about the future have to happen exactly the way you're imagining, or slightly better, or else you're hosed. You're in hot water. So an example of this is if you get a payday loan, I mean, that is assuming that the payday is coming, that it's going to be a certain size, and that nothing else is going to need that money in between now and then. So the car is not going to break down, you're not going to break your leg, and you're not going to run into some unexpected expense like needing to bail out a friend. So if you are out of debt, that instantly makes you more robust. If you have a buffer with just a little bit of money set aside for a rainy day, when the rainy day comes, we don't know what kind of rainy day, but you break your leg, or your car breaks down, or a friend needs help, or then you're okay. And if you have that breathing space to be a little bit more robust, it actually sets you up to enjoy opportunities. Right now, the stock market's tanking, and assuming that it ever recovers again, that would be a really good time to buy. So wouldn't it be nice if you had some savings cashed aside, more than you needed for your toilet paper binge, so that you could throw something into that to reap the rewards after, hopefully it corrects. You can look at scenarios and see, based off of the moving parts, whether or not they are fragile or robust. Sometimes you can't tell, and I think that heuristic you've mentioned about age is an important one. The older something is, the more likely you can say, yeah, that's survived basically everything. That system,
far from certain, but a good heuristic.
That system or that person or that whatever is a really good thing. Not always true. Some bad ideas stick around for a long time. Communism. Yeah, I just went there. So anyway, just going to leave that one hanging in the air. I think that an example of a fragile system is one where you are highly dependent. Did you lose audio? Can you hear me?
No, I can hear you. I just assumed you would keep riffing on that theme.
No, I'm pausing there. You take it away.
Huh. Yeah, well, I think you're probably right. And I'm actually struck quite a bit by so a lot of these ideas about risk that we're talking about, we've pulled from Nassim Taleb. His books, let's see, probably the two most important ones that you could read are The Black Swan and what is it?
Anti-fragile.
Oh, I wasn't going to say anti-fragile, although that's a good one too. I was going to say
Skin in the Game.
Skin in the Game. That's the
That's
one.
a good one.
Skin in the Game is my favorite of his books, but he's written about 5 books, and they all riff on similar themes, but develop those themes in slightly different ways. But so he does quite a few interesting things about risk. So complexity. Well, complexity has an interesting relationship with fragility because there are some complex systems. So Ian's asking, is it? It's also complexity factors into how fragile it is, and yes, but my understanding is at least that that can factor in multiple ways. So complexity can increase your fragility, but can also decrease your fragility. So we might, maybe that would be interesting to drill into. I'm thinking of a complex system that actually is quite robust. So for example, an ant colony, classic example of a complex system. It actually is, quite robust. There's a lot of ants that can die. There's a lot of individual pieces of that system that can die or stop functioning. And the system as a whole, the ant colony in this case, will continue to function. So sometimes complexity can actually be quite the asset to risk survival, right? But then I'm also thinking of, well, it depends on how you define complexity too. I'm thinking of, you could say that our supply chain is quite complex, and it's like, okay, well, we're witnessing some of those vulnerabilities right now. Although actually, I do want to pause here for just a moment, because economic doomsaying is very popular right now, and I do think it is warranted to some degree, right? Like the world economy is going to get clobbered, right? It is absolutely going to take a body blow, and there's virtually no way around that, I don't think. But that said, I don't know exactly how vulnerable our supply chains are, right? When everybody was ripping toilet paper off the shelves early this week and last week, I was thinking, okay, so like this probably isn't a disaster because guess what arrives to the grocery store next Monday morning? Another truck full of toilet paper, right? And guess what arrives the Monday after that? Another truck full of toilet paper. And so, like, I recognize that the panic buying can cause these temporary shortages, but it's not like the toilet paper factory is shutting down, as far as I can tell, right? And so I'm actually, despite all the economic doomsaying and despite the degree to which, I do think that the economy is absolutely going to take a body blow.
I think
we're actually, in many respects, we're quite resilient. Our supply chains actually are quite resilient in many ways. Certainly in terms of a lot of fundamentals and basics, like, for example, toilet paper. So we can continue with the economic doomsaying now. I'm all in favor of that. I just wanted to lodge that point that things are actually, it's not all bad news. It's not all bad news. That's all.
That idea that complexity itself is something that increases fragility, I find my initial instinct was to say, yes, that's part of the problem. But like you raised, ant colony is really interesting because they exhibit a lot of what's called emergent behavior, where it is the actions of a whole bunch of individual actors who have very simple programs that emerge to create patterns seen on the whole. And so it's not complexity in and of itself. I would say that centralization in general makes you more fragile because anything that is centralized has a single point of failure, whereas something that is distributed has a single point of failure, but it's a localized thing where the phenomenon is restricted to a smaller area. Right now, if YouTube at central headquarters goes down, then everybody loses YouTube. But if you have something like torrent, then
BitTorrent is very
exactly
resilient to these
very
kinds of things,
very resilient, including to direct attacks by anti-piracy task forces.
So actually, I do want to make a comment about this because I kind of want to flex my intellectual muscles here just a little bit because I actually have studied complex systems just a little bit in college and also on my own time. And complex system is actually a term of art. So something that complexity scholars, they'll often draw a distinction between complex systems and complicated systems. So a complicated system, there's lots of complicated systems, and a complicated system just means that there's lots of pieces and lots of things going on. But complex systems, actually used as a term of art, do usually have the characteristics of emergent behavior and spontaneous order. I'm pulling this from Wikipedia. It's not my favorite definition of a complex system, but it's not too bad. But complex systems are systems whose behavior is intrinsically difficult to model due to the dependencies, competitions, relationships, or other types of interactions between their parts or between a given system and its environment. Systems that are complex, used as a term of art again, have distinct properties that arise from these relationships, such as nonlinearity, emergence, spontaneous order, adaptation, and feedback loops. So I actually think there might be something. It depends, hang on, I'm tracking back to the original question that Ian Bottomley was asking, right? So complexity factors into how fragile something is. One of the questions you could ask is, okay, well, let's talk about complicated things versus complex things, right? So, for instance, an airplane is complicated, right? Or a car engine is complicated, or a computer is complicated, right? There's lots of pieces, lots of moving pieces, lots of things that have to happen, and it's not particularly resistant to shocks. But things that are complex, and usually I think complexity theorists it's one of the interesting things about complex system is that they don't have a central command system. Right, so the ant queen is actually not ordering everyone around. Instead, all the ants are doing their own little thing, and that's how you get these emergent behaviors. It depends how precisely you're using the word complex, but certainly the people who study complex systems, I think, would say, yeah, like complex systems do tend to be more resistant to shocks. Complicated systems aren't necessarily more resistant to shocks, but complex systems in that technical use are.
Another pun coming. Complicated systems, because they are complicated, have more room to hide bugs than complex systems. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Yeah, no, good.
Yeah, there's some good stuff there. I'm imagining, a free market operates kind of as both types of system. I mean, there are centrally mandated rules that complicate things, but the complex behavior of all the individual people who are choosing what to buy and what not to buy. You see something like a run on the bank, which can emerge as an emergent behavior. I mean, that's a bunch of individual choices deciding to collectively swarm the bank and try to get their money out. And because banks lend more than what they have in stock, they can't handle that, which means that is a lurking risk at all times kind of hanging over the banks, that if people run and try to get their money, only the first so many people in line will be able to get it before the bank has to shut down.
Yeah.
That would be an example of a complex system from an emergent behavior caused a problem. Another example might be riots, where a bunch of people who are ordinarily, decent citizens decide to cause problems.
Yeah.
I mean,
if you want a really good example, if you don't mind me giving this example, so I took a class in college where I actually got to model a couple of complex systems in a piece of software, and it was a lot of fun. But if you picture a bunch of birds, right, like maybe you've watched a flock of birds wheel and swoop through the air, and what those birds are doing, or if you want to, I guess I should clarify, if you want to write a computer program that imitates what those birds do, so you have maybe a bunch of dots on the screen, and you want to make them imitate the behavior of those birds, what you'll do is you'll just give every bird a simple set of instructions. And what you'll say is, okay, have every bird look at the 3 birds closest to it and find all their headings, the headings of those 3 closest birds, average the headings out, and then head in the average direction of the 3 birds closest to it. And so then what you end up with is this cloud of birds that, like, it'll expand a little bit and then contract, and it'll wheel and swoop, and they'll all fly together, even though there's no single bird telling them which direction to go.
And because
that's
they're
a really
referencing
good way to
each
visualize
other,
a complex system.
And because each individual bird is referencing the other ones, you get some really complicated behavior, because it's not. I mean, you have to start modeling all the relationships. 1 connected to 3,
Yes,
so
correct.
each individual point represents 3 contacts. So you basically multiply. I mean, that multiplies the number quite a bit.
And this is why complex systems are notoriously difficult to predict, is because you can't go to the central command system and ask the central command system what's going to happen next. The system itself is kind of figuring out what's going to happen next. And by the way, probably now's a good time to clarify, complex systems definitely can be complicated, right? But so many or most complex systems are complicated, but not all complicated systems are complex. So there is a Venn diagram between those two. They're not mutually exclusive categories.
Sure.
Yeah, I would say that, roughly speaking, a free market economy is, I think, probably best characterized as a mostly complex system, right? There is some central command and instructions. For instance, there's the Federal Reserve that is affecting the money supply, and then there's also Congress that affects the There's a word for it. It's not the money supply. It's
Interest rates.
monetary policy and fiscal policy. That's it. So the Congress manages fiscal policy, which is things like spending and bailouts and all that jazz. And then the Fed in the United States handles monetary policy, and of course that could be different depending on where you live in the world. But there is some central control. But for the very broadly speaking, like a free market economy operates as a complex system. There's a bunch of individual actors, and they're all following their own path and sort of reading the situation around them. And then you get these large scale emergent behaviors. There was nobody who said, hey, everybody, go buy all the toilet paper, to take a very pertinent and recent example. Instead, what happens is every single individual, looks to the left and looks to the right and looks at their room and says, or looks at their house and says, oh my goodness, I don't have any toilet paper. And then when they look to their left, their neighbor is buying toilet paper, and they look to the right and their neighbor is buying toilet paper, and they're like, oh boy, I better buy some toilet paper before it all runs out. So that is one of these emergent behaviors.
Yeah.
And you are right that it makes it very difficult to unravel, right? So to unravel the problem, when one of these complex systems goes wrong, it's not always easy to unravel the problem, because there was no central rule that everybody was following necessarily. And so if a system runs into a problem, as our economic system is running into problems right now, the question is, okay, well, wait, where exactly is the problem? And it's not necessarily easy to pick out, because you have all these little pieces, all the individual agents in the system, acting of their own accord and creating these new behaviors and inventing new ways to be.
It's incredibly difficult to model exactly what an intervention will do.
Yes.
Which is one of the reasons why Nassim Taleb really likes removing things rather than adding things. If you're going to start messing with your diet, which is quite complex, because what you eat interacts with the other things you eat, which interacts with how much sleep you've had and like all this stuff. So if you start adding things, that's going to then interact with everything else that you were eating, and it increases the complexity of the whole. And so if you want to start messing with your diet, he recommends cutting things out, because then you get better data in terms of cause and effect relationships. It's a really, really interesting thing.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's interesting. That makes me wonder a couple of interesting things, because so right now, and I apologize, I'm not 100% up on this, but if you're in the United States, you probably know that Congress is I believe they're currently passing some kind of some kind of legislation where individuals and households will get money, and I'm not going to name the amount of money or the time frame, because I'm going to be wrong if I do that. But that's the basic line. And so something really interesting, and I don't think that's the craziest idea, by the way. But something that's really interesting is that doesn't seem to be the via negativa. So here's an interesting question: what would the via negativa look like for the world economy now, or the U.S. economy, or an individual? Right? What would the via negativa this subtracting instead of adding, but would be a strategy built on that right now in the coronavirus?
Sorry, one more time.
Yeah. So Nassim Taleb proposes via negativa, right?
Sure.
If you're dealing with complexity and you want to adjust a complex system, rather than adding something, take something away. Okay. Well,
sure.
Our supply chains and the economy is a complex system, right? And it's running into problems. So if we want to fix those problems, how would we take Nassim Taleb's advice and employ a via negativa? What would be a via negativa in this case? What would we take away?
I think it would depend on who the actor was, who the person is who is taking things away. So as an individual agent, I would start being aware of parts of my job that need me to be physically present, and I might start cutting those back, so that if something else happened in the future, I'd be able to scale back and do home study and be fine. I don't know, what else would I reduce? And then speaking like from Congress scale stuff, instead of throwing something into the mix, what would you take away? I don't know. I'm having a hard time imagining exactly how to apply the concept.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me throw a really simple one out there that just occurred to me. And by the way, chat, and welcome everybody who just dropped in. If you're watching this, chat, and you want to chime in and think of a via negativa strategy here, one where you sort of remove something from the system in order to try to fix it, rather than adding something in. Well, I mean, if you well, yeah, exactly, right. So Nanu Pelu is mentioning maybe it's time to go to a rural area and be good and basic. And well,
Yes.
I mean, if you hang on, let's talk about this for just a second, because if you go do buy a supply, if you do go buy a supply of toilet paper, right? So now you've got, heaven only knows how many boxes of toilet paper in your basement now, right? You have removed or weakened a tie that you have with the systems around you, right? Isn't that via negativa?
I would
Right,
say
and you haven't
cutting off
and
a
if you
dependence.
well, but you have cut off the dependence to some degree, right?
Well,
You,
it's a
and
strange thing because when an individual actor within the market is cutting off a dependence that they have. So right now, dependencies that I have an internet bill, I have insurance bills, I have a cell phone bill, I've got all these bills, and then I have to go out and buy food because I don't grow my own food, which means I have to buy it because I kind of need to eat in order to live.
yeah,
If
most
I
people
were
do.
to cut that one down significantly by, say, moving to a rural area and growing, I don't know, 60% of my food, let's say I'm
Mhm.
growing almost all my vegetables and all of my carbohydrates. So I've got that taken care of. If I want meat, I kind of have to buy it. And if I want spices, I kind of have to buy those. And if I want something exotic from another place, I have to buy that too.
You're
But
probably not growing pineapple in southeastern Utah.
almost certainly not. You can
Sorry to break
imagine
it to
that
you. I know you were planning on it.
if you imagine the, your bird analogy, talking about how complex systems emerge from the relations between the points. You said that every
Yeah,
point was connected to three others, and that it would average those three nearest birds to figure out its vector. So I've
yeah,
essentially
sure.
cut down the number of utterly essential relationships that dictate my behavior, which means I can act more as an individual. Maybe not completely as an individual, but more as an individual. And therefore, maybe the complexity of the whole system goes down.
Well, hang on, because I'm not sure if you're. I'm are you connecting to that specifically to the via negativa point? Because if not, that's fine, obviously. But I'm interested in this via negativa thing, and I think that is a via
Yes.
negativa,
So imagine all the
right?
birds
So if
have
I
only 2 points that they're connected
well,
to.
well, yeah, sure, but I mean, just a second, because I don't want to talk about the birds yet. But like, just think about toilet paper for a second. So if you have a 6 month supply of toilet paper in your basement, um, you're more resistant to shocks. I think that's via negativa. Um, you've removed one of the complexities of the system. Okay. Now, if you uh, take the advice of yesterday's video and you have, uh, three pieces of pottery, and that's enough to wipe, um, then well, you've just reduced your dependence even more, right? Isn't that via negativa? You're
I
you're
would
uh,
say yes.
removing these you're removing these points of dependence, and I mean, hypothetically, you could go the whole hog and not only homestead in southeastern Utah or wherever, but you could also hypothetically, just live alone in the jungle, all by yourself, nobody else.
In a bunker with a
Yeah, that
huge
you built
supply
your
of.
that you built yourself out of cob, out of mud and straw. So
So 100%, I rely on no one. I think the fundamental issue with
yeah, hang on.
independence.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt you for just 1 second. Sorry, because Chaos Swiss Roll mentioned something, right? So fiscally, from a government standpoint, I think the only things you can do are tax holidays. So tax holiday, yeah, I definitely think I'm going to think for a second about whether or not that's the only thing that could be done. But yeah, so tax holidays does seem like a via negativa, right? Uh, uh, Sort of decompose the system temporarily, break some of those bands and say, okay, things are not going to be tied together for just a little while. That does strike me. Isn't that a via negativa strategy? I think that's a via negativa strategy.
Cutting something out
Yeah.
rather than adding new measures in place, uh,
Okay.
removing burdens that are in place. Um, so you've got two extremes. One of them is to be plugged into every system and every subscription service that you can find, um, food delivered to your door, the whole 9 yards, and then you've got
Yeah.
living in the jungle 100% on your own in a bunker made with your own two hands. And I think the underlying thing here is trust. In
Mhm.
this situation where you're living in the desert or in the jungle 100% by yourself, you trust no one. And in this one
Yeah.
where you're tied into every subscription service, you trust everyone. And is
Uh-huh.
it a good idea to trust everyone? No. Is it a good idea to trust no one? No. Marriage, for instance, is a huge, massive trust fall. Um, my wife and I mean, I have, we've had conversations about how amazing marriage is specifically because of how vulnerable you are. I have committed my life, my soul, my love, my health to this woman, and it's all in her hands. If she decided to do something horrible, I mean, I can't stop her. I have decided to trust her, and that in it is a thing that has increased the quality of my life immeasurably. So you've got this thing where you trust everyone that's wrong, trust no one that's wrong. So maybe it's about trusting appropriately,
Well, yeah,
and I
trusting
think
prudently.
trusting prudently. And I think our current system relies too many trust falls on people I've never met. And I'd like to be just a little bit more in control of who it is that I am handing the blank check to, if that makes
Sure.
sense.
Yeah.
The idea that my supply of toilet paper, which most of us consider to be a necessity, is in the hands of people that you've never met halfway across the planet is a little bit disconcerting.
Well, so actually, I'm glad you brought this up. And actually, well, yeah, we've been running for about 55 minutes, so I think we'll probably go for a few more minutes and then cut it off for today. But I'm
Yes,
actually really
I
glad
need
you
to cut
brought
it
this
off
up
at
because
5.
this is a perpetual point of tension between yourself and myself, actually, which is kind of interesting, right? Because at least in my perception, you tend to be the kind of guy who's like, go build the bunker, right? Go live in the bunker with Cody from Cody's lab, right? And make your own toilet paper and all that jazz, right? And I'm more like, well, I mean, let's see if we can find a way to make this whole city thing work. Like, let's find a way to kind of build those systems and make them trustworthy and make them secure, right? So we share a lot of the same concerns, but end up sometimes aiming in slightly different directions because of that.
Those interested
So
can
I
look
think
at
it's
the
really good to
video
bring that up.
titled "Our City's a Bad Idea." You can
Yeah.
see more of that tension there. Anyway,
Yeah. Well, so I mean, this is one of the things that I think we'll all be asking as we come out of this coronavirus thing, whether it lasts for 2 more weeks or whether it lasts for 2 more years, or heaven forbid longer than that. Is okay. You probably not only should you probably not go live alone in a bunker with Cody, as much fun as it would be to make those videos, but you probably can't even do that, right? Like you probably can't do everything yourself.
you
But
need to
we
buy the tanks
probably
from somewhere. I mean, the giant tanks that he's using to build his Mars habitat. I mean, the fact that we're using these computers to communicate,
Yeah.
there's a lot of benefits that we get from the massive global trust fall that is global supply chain that you kind of need, and or
Yeah.
make things so much more convenient that you can almost call it need.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, and so I think the lesson, I mean, this is the thing that I think we'll be doing is even in places where we're not sort of shortening those supply chains and becoming more self-reliant, I think you certainly do need to take a nice, long, hard look at those supply chains, right? Take a nice, long look at your dependencies and say, hey, wait a second, am I okay with these? Right. And I mean, that's the question. This is not just a personal question. This is a question that all the economies around the world are going to be asking is, hey, wait a second, right? Let's start asking some questions about just how much we can trust everybody and everything around us. And that's not even necessarily a paranoid thing to do. It's just a realistic thing to do, right? Sometimes people and the world and everything comes in for you and is reliable, and sometimes it's not, and you need to learn to be able to tell the difference. And this is an opportunity that we're going to have to pick up on in coming months and years, is to figure out, okay, well, wait a second, just how reliable is everything, and how are we going to build systems that are reliable, and what is that going to look like?
And in addition to that, put yourself in a position where even if they aren't reliable, you're still more or less okay. There's an old saying that knowledge weighs nothing. So if you know about all the alternatives for toilet paper, and someone cuts off your toilet paper, and you know how to use ceramic discs, you're fine. I mean, you really are fine. It becomes a non-issue. It goes from that crisis that you feel when you run out of toilet paper and you're sitting there and you have to do the begging hand outside of the door while saying help, and someone else brings you the toilet paper. That panic that you feel suddenly goes away because you know how to handle it. And so one thing that I think I personally have been trying to do and will continue to try to do is to try to learn about alternatives so that if I need to ramp up the more inefficient capacity to do things myself, I can. Even if it is admittedly worse. The fact that it's now a possibility means that I'm not 100% dependent on the more efficient, hyper-interconnected way.
Okay, well, I think that's a pretty decent place to end. Thanks everybody for watching. We know this is just a hair less polished than some of our content, but it's sure fun. It's been great to talk myself and Joseph, and it's also been great to have you all in the chat so that we can respond to you. So thanks for putting us into your day and inviting us into your social isolation measures wherever you are in the world and whatever it is that you're doing.
And thanks for the conversation. This has been fun.
Absolutely. So we'll probably do another one of these in the near future. I think we're looking at Monday, maybe. Is that correct, Joseph?
I think we should try for another one Monday. That'd be good.
Okay.
Actually, Monday might be a hair complicated. Could we do Tuesday morning?
Looks like we're gonna play this by ear, but maybe Tuesday morning. So yeah, well, I mean, I think the only other thing we have to say besides that is, everyone stay safe and do what you can to prepare, because these things do in fact roll around from time to time. So
see you later.